Have you ever felt like someone or something was watching you, even when you were alone? Imagine signing up for easy money from a sugar daddy, only to be drawn into a nightmarish game where your every move is controlled. Or what if a figure, whistling ominously outside your window at 3:03 a.m., wasn't just a harmless coincidence? Maybe it's a curse. What if your own loved one wasn't acting like themselves, but something far more sinister was hiding behind their eyes? In these twisted tales, nothing is as it seems. Each step you take only leads you deeper into horror. Stay tuned, because these stories are about to make you question what's real and what isn't. I had just started college, and the rent was piling up. I couldn't work full time, so when Alden reached out, it seemed like the perfect solution. A man in his late 40s, he offered to pay for my company. No strings attached. He'd send me cash to keep him company, talk to him on the phone, and occasionally have dinner with him. It didn't seem weird. I could live with that. He told me he had a lot of money to spare, and that the only thing he needed was someone to talk to. No promises, no weird expectations. Just a sugar daddy who wanted companionship. And at first, I didn't think twice. He wasn't asking for anything out of the ordinary, and the money was easy, until it wasn't. I noticed something off in his messages after the first week. Wear the red dress tonight. Send me a picture of you in it when you do. I didn't think much of it. After all, it was just a dress. But as time passed, the requests started to get more specific and oddly sexual. Stand in front of a mirror while holding a knife. That one made me feel uncomfortable, but I did it anyway, rationalizing that it was harmless. But when I looked in the mirror, my reflection seemed wrong. It wasn't the dress or the knife, but something else in my eyes. The longer I stared, the darker my reflection became. The requests kept coming, becoming more frequent and more unsettling. He wanted me to place candles around the room and light them, while I whispered things into the darkness. I felt as if something inside me was growing numb, each new request erasing a little bit of my sense of self. The worst one came when he asked me to video myself at night, turning the lights off and recording myself doing nothing for an hour. The feeling of being watched was palpable. When I sent the video, he replied, "I see everything. You're not alone." It got worse from there. Every time I sent him a picture or did what he asked, it was like he knew my every move, even the things I didn't share. One day, I received a photo in my messages. It was of me from the previous night, standing in front of my window, my face obscured in shadow, captured while I was completely asleep. "You look beautiful while you sleep," the message read. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced out the window. Nothing. Who was watching me? I tried to break it off with Alden, but he wouldn't let me. The next night, I received a call. The voice on the other end was slow and deliberate. "You thought you could leave? You'll never escape me." Panic surged through me. I quickly checked the locks, the windows, everything. But when I went to bed that night, I heard something outside my door. It was light at first. A soft tap, tap, tap. I pressed my ear to the door, and suddenly the door handle rattled. I jumped back. My phone buzzed. I'm in the building. The next morning, Alden was gone. The apartment was empty, and I thought I had finally escaped. But the truth was far worse. Days later, I started to receive more texts, but they weren't from Alden. They were from unknown numbers, and each one came with a photo. Pictures of me, taken in my own apartment while I slept. I don't know how he did it, but Alden was still out there, watching me. And now it's become clear. He'll never stop. The first night I heard the whistling, I thought it was just a bird or some neighbor messing around. But when it happened again the next night at exactly 3:03 a.m., I started to feel a creeping unease. It wasn't the sound that bothered me at first. It was the precision. The whistling was exactly the same each time. So consistent, it almost seemed unnatural. By the third night, I knew it wasn't just a coincidence. I mentioned the whistling to a neighbor, but they just brushed it off. Old house noises. People think there's something strange going on here, but it's all just stories. But there was an old woman who lived down the street. She gave me a grave look when I mentioned it. "Whatever you do," she warned, "don't go outside when you hear it. Don't look out the window. It's too late for me, but it doesn't have to be too late for you." I ignored the warning. One night, I decided I would see who or what was making the sound. At exactly 3:03, I crept out of bed and peered through the window. That's when I saw it. A tall, hunched figure walking slowly past my house. The thing was whistling, but when it turned its head toward me, its eyes glowed, bright yellow, unnatural, like a wolf in the night. I froze, unable to look away, as it continued its eerie whistle, taking its time as it passed by. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I heard the whistling again, but this time it was closer. I stayed inside, but I could hear it getting nearer. Tap, tap, tap. A footstep on the porch. I held my breath. Then, just like that, it stopped. But the whistling wasn't gone. It was in my head now, a constant echo that wouldn't leave me. And every time it whistled, I felt as though something was getting closer, closing in on me. I began asking around about the creature that whistled. One night, I found a journal at an old estate sale, written by someone who had lived in this house decades ago. It described a man who had died in an accident, but before his death, he had made a pact to never be forgotten. His whistling was his curse, and it would continue to haunt those who stayed in the house. That night, the whistling came again, but this time it wasn't at 3:03. It was louder, as if it had come from inside the house. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted from the house in a panic, but when I stepped outside, there it was, standing in front of me, whistling. Its figure was shadowed, but I could feel the malice radiating from it. "You should have stayed inside," it whispered. That night, I moved out, but no matter where I go, I can still hear that whistling at 3:03 a.m. It's always there. It started with a dream. I had been staying at my cousin's place when I saw something under the bed. It was a black, shapeless mass, like a sphere made of shadows. It hovered just beneath the bed, its tendrils creeping out to touch the floor. I woke up drenched in sweat, trying to convince myself it was just a bad dream. But the next day, I saw the same shape on a ghost hunting show. The woman on the show described a creature that sounded exactly like what I saw. A shadow sphere that crawled beneath the floorboards and into the hearts of its victims. She said it thrived on fear, grew stronger the more terrified you were. I didn't want to believe it, but as the days passed, I started to feel it, a presence lurking in the corners of the room. I tried to dismiss it, but at night, the shadow grew more defined. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find it under my bed, its glowing eyes peering up at me. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was undeniable. The fear grew with every encounter. It would follow me from room to room, getting closer each time, until I could no longer sleep. I was starting to lose my mind. Desperate, I set up cameras in my room to capture the thing. The footage was chilling. I watched as the shadow started to move. Slowly, it stretched from under the bed and expanded, like it was alive. The once formless sphere grew legs, spindly and black, and it crawled toward the camera. I froze, staring at the screen. But when I looked back at my room, it was gone. And the worst part, the camera stopped recording, as if it had turned them off. I was trapped with something that controlled technology itself. That night, I tried to sleep with every light on, hoping it would keep the thing at bay. But it didn't matter. As soon as I closed my eyes, I felt it. Cold fingers brushing against my legs. I jumped up, heart racing, but the shadow wasn't visible. It was inside me now. The longer I stayed, the more I could hear it. A low, guttural growl, whispering my name. "You can't escape me," it hissed. It was learning, growing, and I realized with horror that it was getting stronger, feeding off my fear. I packed my bags, ready to leave, but as I turned to leave the room, the door slammed shut. The shadow appeared before me, towering over me with eyes that gleamed like burning coal. "You can't leave," it said. The last thing I saw was its black tendrils wrapping around me, pulling me down into the darkness. I woke up in the same room. The shadow was gone, but the nightmares never stopped. It followed me home. Every night, I hear its whispers, feel its touch, and I know it's always waiting for me to sleep again. At first, it was just weird. I'd walk into a room and see her standing there, staring at me from the corner, not moving. She would be completely still, just watching. I thought she was simply lost in thought. But after the fourth time it happened, I started to feel off. It wasn't like her. She wasn't the type to stand still and stare. And when I asked her about it, she brushed it off. Then, one evening, I came home late from work. I unlocked the door and called her name, but there was no response. The house was eerily quiet. I checked every room, but I couldn't find her. It wasn't until I walked into the kitchen that I saw her. Her eyes were wide, her face pale, and she was crouched behind the counter, watching me. "I didn't want to scare you," she whispered. "I thought I heard something." That's when I realized it wasn't her acting strange. It was something else inside her. As days passed, the behavior became more erratic. She started whispering to herself in the middle of the night, low, indecipherable words. I could hear her pacing around the house, moving through rooms, sometimes stopping to peer through the cracks in doors, or even standing motionless behind furniture, her eyes locked onto me. Every night, I would hear the creaking of her footsteps, just out of reach, as though she was watching me while I slept. It wasn't her anymore. It was something else. One morning, I woke up to find her standing at the foot of our bed, her eyes wide and unblinking. I asked her what was wrong, but she didn't respond. Instead, she whispered something in a voice that wasn't hers. "You're not going to make it." It felt like she was gone. Her body was there, but her soul was somewhere else. I started doing some research. I found a disturbing pattern. People who had similar experiences with loved ones exhibited the same behaviors. A demonic presence, something that took hold and slowly drove them mad. I tried to confront her, but she only smiled coldly and asked, "Why don't you trust me?" I tried to leave the house, but every time I would pack, she'd appear from the shadows, watching me, always close behind. I couldn't escape her. She would laugh quietly, her voice sounding more like a growl. "You can't leave. I'm always here." Every time I tried to get out, she would whisper, "I'm watching you." And I knew. She was never really my wife anymore. I had to leave for my own sanity. The night I left, I locked the doors and made sure she couldn't follow. But when I looked back one last time, I saw her silhouette standing in the window, her face pressed against the glass, smiling. "You think you're safe, but I'm always here," she whispered from the darkness. I could feel her eyes on me, wherever I went. She was still watching. It began with the deaths, more than usual, for no apparent reason. It wasn't just that the patients were dying, it was the sheer frequency. In a matter of weeks, several beloved patients passed unexpectedly, leaving the staff shaken. As a nurse, I'd seen death before, but this was different. It wasn't normal. It felt like something was taking them. Then, it spread. It wasn't just the patients anymore. A colleague of mine, Maria, lost her fiancé in a car crash. He was young, healthy. Then, another nurse's son fell seriously ill and died in his sleep. The atmosphere at the hospital began to feel oppressive, like the walls were closing in. It was as if we were cursed. I tried to brush it off, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized something was off. I began to see things out of the corner of my eye. Figures standing at the foot of patient beds. Shadows that weren't there. One night, I saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, staring at me. When I approached, it was gone, but the feeling remained, like something was waiting. The deaths continued, but they were more than just sad. They were suspicious. The patients who died weren't supposed to. I started hearing whispers from the other nurses. Talk of a curse, an old legend about a death spirit that followed people home from the hospital, making sure that the bad luck spread. The worst came when I was called to a patient's room late one night. She had been stable, but when I entered, I found her eyes wide open, her face frozen in a look of terror. On the wall beside her bed, written in blood, were the words, "You're next." My hands shook as I backed away, realizing that this curse wasn't something we could outrun. It was real. I never returned to that hospital after that night. The deaths continued, even after I left. I couldn't escape it. No matter where I went, it felt like something was always watching. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those words. "You are next." And I know it's not over. The curse follows me still. Like and subscribe for more epic horror stories, or I will feel bad. What if the darkest truths were hidden in plain sight? From a haunted farm where families' killers remained unknown, to a killer clown who fooled an entire city. These are stories that defy logic and chill the soul. Tonight, we unravel 5 of the most disturbing true crime cases ever told. Get ready to question everything you thought you knew about fear, murder, and the evil that lurks in the shadows. In rural Bavaria, Germany, on a remote farm called Hinterkaifeck, the Gruber family lived in seclusion. The family was composed of Andreas Gruber, his wife, their daughter, and their son-in-law. A maid, hired by the family, worked for them as well. The area was isolated, no neighbors for miles, which meant any sound, any movement would be noticed. But something sinister lurked on the farm. Over the course of several weeks, Andreas reported hearing strange noises in the attic and outside his window. He discovered footprints leading from the forest to the barn and back again, but no one could figure out where they came from. The farm had a feeling of dread about it, but the ultimate horror was still to come. On the night of March 31st, 1922, the entire Gruber family was brutally murdered. Andreas and his wife were found bludgeoned to death in their bedroom. Their daughter and son-in-law met a similar fate. The maid was murdered later, her body found in the same area. The killer had used a pickaxe, which was found next to the bodies. But what made this crime even more disturbing was the aftermath. The murderer didn't immediately flee. The killer seemed to have taken his time, making himself at home in the farmhouse. It is believed that the killer spent several days in the house after the murders, living in the attic, stealing food, and even making signs of being present, like lighting a fire. The discovery of a bloody axe and the strange behavior of the killer left many questions unanswered. Authorities arrived, but they found no signs of forced entry. It seemed as though the murderer knew the family, which made the case even more disturbing. The local police and investigators turned up no concrete leads. The family's close circle of acquaintances didn't seem to have any motive for murder. The case was shrouded in mystery. Despite the investigation, there was a haunting detail that was too eerie to ignore. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises emanating from the house for days after the killings. Some claimed to have heard the sound of a violin playing, while others said they could hear whispers. What was even more unnerving was the discovery of footprints leading to and from the house that seemed to vanish into thin air. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case was the discovery of a footprint in the snow that appeared to have come from the killer himself. The trail led directly from the woods to the barn and then to the house. It was impossible to trace it any further. The local police were stumped. At one point, rumors started to swirl that the murderer could have been someone hiding in the attic the entire time. Someone who had learned the family's routine and exploited their vulnerability. But who could it have been? Several suspects were suggested, but no one could truly explain the eerie events surrounding the murders. In the end, the case went cold. Over the years, numerous theories have emerged about what happened on the Hinterkaifeck farm. Some suggest that it was a family member who had lost control, possibly the son-in-law who had a strained relationship with the family. Others believed it was a stranger who had been living on the farm in secret, hiding in the attic and making the noises Andreas had reported hearing. There were also whispers that a local man, known to have had a relationship with the maid, could have been the killer. However, the police were never able to uncover enough evidence to arrest anyone. The mystery has haunted the region for decades. To this day, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain unsolved. The house where the murders took place still stands, abandoned, and is considered one of the most haunted locations in Germany. Tourists visit the area, drawn by the grim history of the crime. And despite numerous investigations over the years, no one has ever been charged with the murders. The strange circumstances surrounding the case, the lingering presence in the house, the mysterious footprints, the lack of clear motives, ensure that Hinterkaifeck will remain a chilling unsolved mystery forever. Villisca, Iowa, was a sleepy town in the early 1900s. The town was small, the streets quiet, and the people friendly. Families lived in peace, and everyone knew one another. The Moore family, consisting of Josiah, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children, were a beloved family in town. They had recently invited 2 friends of their children to spend the night with them, creating a cheerful atmosphere in the house. But on the night of June 9th, 1912, that peace was shattered. In a shocking act of violence, the entire family, along with the 2 children, was slaughtered in their sleep. The killer used an axe to bludgeon each of the victims, and the crime was so brutal that it sent shockwaves throughout the town and the entire country. The bodies were discovered the next morning when a neighbor noticed the family's usual morning activities hadn't occurred. The Moore family's house was eerily silent. When the neighbor entered the home, the sight was horrifying. The bodies were sprawled throughout the house, their faces covered by sheets. The murderer had taken care to cover their victims' faces, perhaps to hide the brutality of the crime, or perhaps as a perverse act of respect. What was even more chilling was the fact that the killer seemed to have spent the night in the house. After the murders, the killer had made himself at home, eating a meal from the family's food supply, and even sitting in a rocking chair. Local authorities were called to the scene, but the case quickly became one of the most puzzling investigations in history. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing had been stolen. The axe used in the crime belonged to the Moore family. There were no clues pointing to the identity of the killer. Theories began to form. Some believed the killer was someone who knew the family well. Was it a relative or an acquaintance? Others thought it might be a traveling man who had stayed in town. The townspeople were gripped by fear, and suspicions ran high. The killer's methodical actions raised several disturbing questions. How did the murderer know that the family would be vulnerable? How did he remain undetected for so long? Some investigators speculated that the killer had been hiding in the house before the murders, waiting for the family to fall asleep. What was perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that the killer had returned to the house after committing the murders. The fact that the killer had eaten and rested in the home suggested that he felt comfortable there, as though it wasn't just about the murders. It was about the complete violation of a family's private space. Over the years, several suspects were considered. One of the most prominent was a man named Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher who had been in Villisca at the time of the murders. He had been acting strangely in the days leading up to the crime, and some people believed he was the killer. However, there was no solid evidence linking him to the crime, and the investigation went cold. Another suspect was a man named Frank Jones, a local businessman who had a long-standing feud with Josiah Moore. Despite many theories and potential suspects, the true identity of the killer remained elusive. The Villisca Axe murders remain one of the most infamous unsolved murder cases in American history. Numerous investigations have taken place over the years, but no one has ever been convicted of the crime. The eerie thought that a killer may have been hiding in plain sight, watching the family, still haunts the town of Villisca. The Moore house still stands as a grim reminder of the brutal murders, and the town itself continues to carry the weight of this chilling mystery. At first, it was just weird. I'd walk into a room and see her standing there, staring at me from the corner, not moving. She would be completely still, just watching. I thought she was simply lost in thought. But after the fourth time it happened, I started to feel off. It wasn't like her. She wasn't the type to stand still and stare. And when I asked her about it, she brushed it off. Then, one evening, I came home late from work. I unlocked the door and called her name, but there was no response. The house was eerily quiet. I checked every room, but I couldn't find her. It wasn't until I walked into the kitchen that I saw her. Her eyes were wide, her face pale, and she was crouched behind the counter, watching me. "I didn't want to scare you," she whispered. "I thought I heard something." That's when I realized it wasn't her acting strange. It was something else inside her. As days passed, the behavior became more erratic. She started whispering to herself in the middle of the night, low, indecipherable words. I could hear her pacing around the house, moving through rooms, sometimes stopping to peer through the cracks in doors, or even standing motionless behind furniture, her eyes locked onto me. Every night, I would hear the creaking of her footsteps, just out of reach, as though she was watching me while I slept. It wasn't her anymore. It was something else. One morning, I woke up to find her standing at the foot of our bed, her eyes wide and unblinking. I asked her what was wrong, but she didn't respond. Instead, she whispered something in a voice that wasn't hers. "You're not going to make it." It felt like she was gone. Her body was there, but her soul was somewhere else. I started doing some research. I found a disturbing pattern. People who had similar experiences with loved ones exhibited the same behaviors. A demonic presence, something that took hold and slowly drove them mad. I tried to confront her, but she only smiled coldly and asked, "Why don't you trust me?" I tried to leave the house, but every time I would pack, she'd appear from the shadows, watching me, always close behind. I couldn't escape her. She would laugh quietly, her voice sounding more like a growl. "You can't leave. I'm always here." Every time I tried to get out, she would whisper, "I'm watching you." And I knew. She was never really my wife anymore. I had to leave for my own sanity. The night I left, I locked the doors and made sure she couldn't follow. But when I looked back one last time, I saw her silhouette standing in the window, her face pressed against the glass, smiling. "You think you're safe, but I'm always here," she whispered from the darkness. I could feel her eyes on me, wherever I went. She was still watching. In 1692, in the Puritan town of Salem, Massachusetts, something extraordinary and horrifying occurred. It all began when several young girls claimed to be possessed by spirits, and soon after, accusations of witchcraft began to spread like wildfire. The town's deeply religious and superstitious mindset made it fertile ground for fear to take root. The hysteria escalated quickly, and soon the entire community was embroiled in a mass panic. People who had lived alongside each other for years turned on one another, accusing friends, family members, and even strangers of being witches. As the accusations continued to spread, fear became the driving force in Salem. People were arrested based on the flimsiest of evidence, Testimonies from children, unexplained ailments, and simple grudges were enough to condemn someone as a witch. No one was safe, and the lines between reality and superstition became dangerously blurred. People were thrown into prison, where they were tortured into confessing. Many accused others, perpetuating the cycle of fear and paranoia. The court system became a tool of terror, and soon the trials had escalated into a full-blown witch hunt. The witch trials became a spectacle, and the trials themselves were little more than sham proceedings. There was no real evidence of witchcraft, just fear, superstition, and unfounded accusations. But the court accepted the evidence that was presented, including spectral evidence, where the accused ghost was said to have appeared to the accusers. The result was a terrifying wave of executions. 20 innocent people were put to death, and many others were imprisoned or tortured. The town was torn apart as people tried to protect themselves by accusing others, and families were destroyed by the paranoia. As the trials raged on, the first seeds of doubt were planted. Some began to question whether the hysteria was driven by real evidence or by fear and greed. Eventually, the trials began to lose steam, and a new governor stepped in, bringing an end to the madness. The trials became a symbol of how fear can drive a community to commit horrific acts. In hindsight, the Salem witch trials are viewed as one of the darkest periods in American history. The aftermath of the trials was devastating. Families were left without loved ones, and the community was forever scarred. The accused, even those who had survived, lived with the shame of having been labeled a witch. The trials left deep psychological scars that would take generations to heal. The hysteria and the wrongful deaths continued to haunt Salem. It served as a grim reminder of how fear and paranoia can take over even the most rational minds. The Salem witch trials may have ended, but their legacy endures. The trials are often cited as a cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria, superstition, and the potential for injustice. To this day, the story of Salem serves as a chilling reminder that in times of fear, reason often gives way to violence. Issei Sagawa's obsession with cannibalism began at a young age. He fantasized about eating human flesh, believing that it would grant him the power he desired. His obsessions grew, and he fixated on a particular woman, Renee Hartevelt, a Dutch student in Paris. Sagawa invited her to his apartment, where his dark plans were set in motion. On the night of June 11th, 1981, Sagawa murdered Renee, shooting her in the back of the head before dismembering her body. He spent several days consuming parts of her flesh and even took photographs of the act. The brutal murder was not a crime of passion, but of obsession. Sagawa's twisted fantasies had come to life. Sagawa was arrested when he attempted to dispose of Renee's remains, but the authorities were initially skeptical. His calm demeanor and apparent lack of remorse shocked everyone. The details of the crime were grotesque, but Sagawa showed no fear of the consequences. Sagawa's case took a bizarre turn when he was declared legally insane and sent to a mental institution. Despite his horrific crime, the French courts did not find him fit to stand trial. The legal system had failed to deliver justice. Sagawa was eventually deported to Japan, where his disturbing story gained him a grotesque kind of fame. Sagawa's media appearances shocked the world. He spoke freely about his crime, Imagine moving into your dream home only to realize someone has been watching you, tracking your every move. Imagine hearing a stranger's desperate sobs on the phone, begging for forgiveness after brutally killing someone. And then, imagine finding out someone's been living in the walls of your house, watching you from the darkness. These aren't just stories. They happened, and they could happen to anyone. Stay close, because by the time you hear the whole story, you might never feel safe again. When we moved into 657 Boulevard, we thought it was the beginning of our perfect life. The house was a stunning colonial-style home in a quiet suburban town with the kind of charm you only see in movies. We had everything we ever wanted. A big yard for the kids to play in, spacious rooms, and neighbors who waved as we drove by. It was the American dream, but dreams can quickly turn into nightmares. The first letter came 3 days after we moved in. It was a plain white envelope with no return address, addressed to the new owners. I didn't think much of it. Probably a welcome letter from a neighbor or something. But as soon as I opened it, my stomach dropped. "Dearest new owners," the letter began. "Allow me to introduce myself. I am the Watcher, and I have been watching 657 Boulevard for years, as my father did before me, and his father before him. Now it is my turn to watch you. Welcome to your new home." I laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of prank, but as I read on, the tone shifted from strange to sinister. The Watcher described intimate details about us, our children's names, where they played, and how long we'd been in the house. He ended the letter with a chilling question. "Have you found what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard?" I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning. A week went by before the second letter arrived. By this point, I had nearly forgotten about the first one, convincing myself it was just a weird joke. But when I opened the envelope, the same eerie feeling washed over me. The letter wasn't just creepy, it was personal. "I see you have started renovations. Is that for the family's sake, or the house's?" How could they know? We hadn't told anyone about the renovations, not even our neighbors. But the Watcher knew. Every detail of our lives seemed to be under scrutiny, like there were eyes everywhere, always watching. "The children are so young. Have you thought about what the house wants for them? The house has a history, and it craves young blood." The police were no help. They said the letters were probably a prank, maybe from a disgruntled former owner or a bored neighbor, but it didn't feel like a joke. Whoever was sending these letters knew too much about us, about the house. It was like they were inside, observing us from the shadows. Every time the kids played in the backyard, I felt a pair of unseen eyes, watching, waiting. The third letter changed everything. It wasn't just a veiled threat, it was a declaration. 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades. It is now my time to watch, as it was my father's and grandfather's. Have you found the secrets yet, or will I have to show them to you? The tone of the letter was more aggressive, more demanding. Whoever the Watcher was, they weren't satisfied with just observing anymore. They wanted us to know that they were in control. And worse, they seemed to be getting closer. I started checking the windows every night, locking the doors twice before going to bed. My husband said I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even when we were alone. It was as if the house itself was alive. breathing, waiting for something to happen. One night, while I was sitting in the living room, I swore I saw a shadow move outside the window. But when I ran to check, there was nothing there, just the darkness pressing in against the glass. The fourth letter arrived in the dead of night. This time, it wasn't just a warning. It was a demand. Have you found what's hidden in the walls yet? The house won't rest until you do. Your family is just the beginning. I couldn't sleep that night. The words haunted me. What did the watcher mean by what's hidden in the walls? I started to doubt everything. Every creak, every groan the house made in the middle of the night. Were we alone, or was there something else living in the walls? The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I started searching the house, pulling back carpets, tapping on walls, looking for anything out of the ordinary. But there was nothing. No hidden rooms, no secret passages. Just an old house, creaking under the weight of time. But the watcher wasn't done with us yet. The fifth letter was the breaking point. It was short, simple, and terrifying. This will be my last letter. I have been patient, but now the house needs blood. I can hear it in the walls. If you do not leave, I will have no choice but to show you the true nature of 657 Boulevard. Time is running out. The message was clear. We were no longer welcome in our own home. The watcher was done waiting, and I could feel the tension in the house building, like a storm ready to break. I begged my husband to leave, but he refused. He said the letters were nothing more than empty threats, that there was no real danger. But I knew better. Something was coming, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what it was. In the end, it wasn't a decision. It was a necessity. The fear had taken hold of me, and I couldn't live like that anymore. The watcher had won. We packed our things and left in the middle of the night. As we drove away, I looked back at the house one last time, watching as it disappeared into the darkness. I couldn't help but wonder if the watcher was out there, standing in the shadows, watching us leave. We never found out who the watcher was or what they wanted. The police investigated, but the trail went cold. No fingerprints, no suspects, just the lingering fear that, somewhere out there, the watcher is still waiting. It was the middle of the night when the call came in, thin, trembling, and choked with sobs. The voice on the other end of the line wasn't angry or aggressive. It was pleading, desperate, as if the man was drowning in his own guilt. "Oh my God, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to kill her. Please, you have to find her. I need help. I'm so sorry." The dispatcher tried to ask questions, but the man just kept repeating himself, his weepy voice rising and falling in hysterical apology. Then, as quickly as he had called, he hung up, leaving only the sound of dead air behind. Minutes later, the body of Karen Potak was found, brutally beaten and left for dead on a frozen street in Minneapolis. The police had no clues, no witnesses, only the sound of a man's weeping voice echoing on the 911 tape. It wasn't long before the second call came. The voice was the same, sobbing, panicked, filled with regret. "I did it again. I can't stop. You have to stop me, please." This time, the body of Kimberly Compton was discovered, a 20-year-old woman stabbed to death after getting off a bus. Again, the caller provided just enough information to lead the police to the body, but never enough to catch him. The press dubbed him the weepy-voiced killer, and the entire city of Minneapolis was gripped by fear. Who was this man who murdered with such brutality, yet cried like a lost child afterward? Why did he keep calling, confessing to his crimes, but always disappearing before the police could find him? As the months passed, the calls kept coming. Each time, the killer's voice was the same, pleading for forgiveness, begging for someone to stop him, even as he described his next victim's body with chilling accuracy. "I can't help myself. Please, God, forgive me. I'm so sorry." His victims were random, young women with no connection to each other, except for the brutality of their deaths. The police were growing desperate, but the killer always seemed to slip through their fingers, leaving behind nothing but the sound of his haunting, weeping voice. For the people of Minneapolis, every night felt like a countdown. Who would be next? Where would the killer strike again? Everything changed when one of his victims survived. Denise Williams had been attacked, stabbed multiple times, but managed to fight back, kicking the killer and escaping to a nearby road where she was found by a passing driver. Her description of the attacker was vague, but it gave the police their first real lead. He was a small, unassuming man, someone who looked ordinary, maybe even harmless, but there was something wild in his eyes, something that told her he wouldn't stop until someone made him. For the first time, the police felt they were closing in on the killer. But even as they hunted him, the calls kept coming. In 1982, the police finally caught a break. A man named Paul Michael Stefani was arrested after attempting to kill another woman. And when they played the tapes of the weepy-voiced calls, the match was undeniable. Stephanie's voice was the same, high-pitched, pleading, filled with guilt and fear. In the interrogation room, Stephanie broke down. He confessed to the murders, his voice trembling just as it had on the 911 calls. He spoke of the overwhelming rage that took over when he killed, the voices in his head that wouldn't stop until he acted. And every time he said, the regret was immediate, crushing him like a wave of sorrow the moment the violence was done. Paul Michael Stephanie was convicted of multiple murders, but the mystery of the weepy-voiced killer never truly ended. Even after his arrest, there were those who wondered if he was truly the only one responsible, if the calls were part of something deeper, something more disturbed than just a single man's madness. Stephanie died in prison in 1998, but his voice, those desperate, weeping pleas for forgiveness, still haunt the recordings. The tears were real, but so were the brutal murders, and the city of Minneapolis will never forget the killer who wept for his own sins, even as he committed them. T started with the scratching, tiny, almost imperceptible, like the sound of mice scurrying through the walls. At first, we barely noticed it. Our new house was old, after all, and old houses make noise. But then the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. I would be lying in bed at night, just about to drift off to sleep, when I'd hear it, a faint tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. I'd sit up, heart pounding, but the sound would stop as soon as I listened closely. We told ourselves it was nothing, just the house settling, just our imaginations. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, the noises changed. Instead of scratching, we heard footsteps, soft, shuffling, like someone walking slowly across the attic floor. My husband grabbed a flashlight, determined to prove it was just a raccoon or some other animal that had gotten inside. But when we climbed into the attic, it was empty. No sign of animals, no broken windows or loose boards where something could have gotten in. Just the silence of an old house creaking under its own weight. But I could feel it. Someone had been there. I knew it. The next time I heard the noise, I decided to investigate on my own. The sound was coming from the air vent, a faint whisper, like someone talking just out of earshot. I leaned in closer, straining to hear, and that's when I heard it. "I can see you." My heart stopped. I pulled back, staring at the vent, but there was no one there. No sign of anyone at all. But the voice, it was real. I know it was. I told my husband, but he didn't believe me. He said I was just hearing things, that the stress of the move was getting to me. But I knew what I heard, and I wasn't the only one. A few weeks later, we started to notice things going missing. Small items at first. A set of keys, a pair of socks. Then, larger things. An entire carton of milk from the fridge, a blanket from the living room. It didn't make any sense. No one could have gotten inside. We were locking the doors, keeping the windows shut tight. But things kept disappearing, and the noises in the walls were getting worse. One day, I was cleaning out a closet when I found something that made my blood run cold. There, behind the old coats and boxes, was a tiny door I had never noticed before. It was barely big enough for a child to crawl through, leading into the dark space between the walls. I called my husband, and we opened the door together. What we found inside made my skin crawl. Inside the tiny crawl space were blankets, empty food containers, and even a small radio. Someone had been living in our walls. Someone who had been watching us, listening to us, and stealing from us without us ever knowing. I wanted to call the police, but my husband insisted on checking the rest of the house first. We searched every room, every hidden space, but there was no sign of the intruder. Whoever had been living in the walls was gone, but the fear never left. Every time I heard a creak or a whisper, I wondered if they had come back, if they were still watching us from the shadows. The last time I saw him, it was in the middle of the night. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the hallway outside our bedroom. I got up, heart pounding, and opened the door just in time to see a figure disappearing around the corner. I chased after him, but by the time I reached the stairs, he was gone. The door to the attic was open, but there was no one inside. I knew then that he had been there all along, hiding in the walls, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. We moved out of the house soon after. I couldn't stay there any longer, not knowing if the stranger in the walls would ever come back. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone walking just beyond the edge of my vision. It all started when I found the first photograph, a grainy, black and white image of me standing outside my house, taken from a distance. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was an old photo someone had left behind, a forgotten snapshot from the past. But then I looked closer. The clothes I was wearing in the photo were the same ones I had worn just the day before. And the house in the background, it was my house, exactly as it looked now. Someone had taken a picture of me without my knowledge. Someone had been watching. Over the next few weeks, more photographs started to appear. They were left in my mailbox, slipped under my door, even tucked into the windshield wiper of my car. Each one was a candid shot of me, walking to my car, sitting at a cafe, even through the window of my bedroom. Whoever was taking these photos knew my routine. They knew where I would be, and they were getting closer. One day, I found a photo of myself sleeping. The angle was strange, like it had been taken from above, as if someone had been standing over my bed. The photos weren't just of me anymore. In some of the pictures, there was something else. A shadowy figure in the background, barely visible, but unmistakably there. Whoever was taking the photos wasn't alone. They were being watched too. I started to feel paranoid, always looking over my shoulder, wondering who was out there with a camera, waiting for the perfect shot. But no matter how hard I looked, I never saw anyone. The photos kept coming, and the shadow in the background grew clearer with each one. I decided to confront whoever was sending the photos. I set up a camera of my own, hoping to catch the person in the act. For days, I watched the footage, but there was nothing. No one delivering the photos, no one lurking outside my house. Then, one night, I heard a noise, a soft click, like the shutter of a camera. I ran to the window, but there was no one there. The next morning, I found a new photograph waiting for me. This time, it was a picture of me looking out the window, searching for the photographer. The message was clear. They were always one step ahead. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I waited by the window for hours, hoping to catch the person in the act. Just as I was about to give up, I saw him, a figure standing across the street, holding a camera, staring right at me. I grabbed my phone and called the police, but by the time they arrived, the photographer was gone. All they found was a single photograph left on my doorstep. It was a picture of me, holding the phone, with the police lights flashing in the background. The photographer was taunting me, showing me that they could always get closer than I thought. The last photo I received was the most disturbing of all. It was a picture of an empty street. No people, no cars, just a long, deserted road stretching into the distance. At first, I didn't understand what it meant, but then it hit me. The street in the photo was the one I lived on, and the angle of the shot was from right outside my front door. Whoever had taken the photo had been standing there, just a few feet away from where I slept, watching and waiting. I never received another photo after that. The phantom photographer disappeared as suddenly as they had come, leaving only a trail of eerie, unsettling images behind. These stories remind us of one chilling truth. Sometimes the real monsters aren't from our nightmares. They're the strangers lurking in plain sight. If you want more terrifying true encounters like these, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. There's always more to uncover, and some stories are just beginning. Picture this. It's midnight, and you're in the middle of the wilderness. No cell service, no help. Suddenly, a low whistle breaks the silence. A whistle so human, yet so wrong. It circles your camp, coming closer with each passing moment. You're frozen in place, clutching your flashlight. And then you see it. A figure just beyond the light's edge. Tonight, we unraveled the 5 most disturbing camping encounters ever recorded. Stories that will make you think twice before stepping into the woods. Ethan and Rachel are introduced as a nature-loving couple, looking to reconnect with each other and escape their stressful city lives. They meticulously plan their trip to the Appalachian wilderness, ensuring they pick a secluded spot with minimal human interference. As they hike deeper into the forest, Rachel begins to notice the peculiar stillness. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves. Ethan dismisses her concerns, attributing it to their distance from typical hiking trails. They find the perfect camping spot by a creek and set up camp. The day passes peacefully, but the unnatural quiet lingers as the sun sets. The couple enjoys their first night, sitting by the campfire. Suddenly, a faint whistle cuts through the silence. It's short, 2 distinct notes, but the eerie human-like tone sends a chill down Rachel's spine. Ethan jokes, "Must be the wind," but even he feels unsettled. Over the next hour, the whistling grows louder and appears to move, coming from different directions around their camp. As they climb into their tent, Rachel can't shake the feeling that they're being watched. The following morning, the couple tries to rationalize the previous night's events. They brush it off as a prank or an echo, despite Rachel's insistence that it felt too deliberate. While exploring the nearby area, they find peculiar markings on trees, long, parallel scratches, too symmetrical to be natural. Ethan starts to worry, but keeps quiet to avoid alarming Rachel. That evening, the whistling returns, louder and more erratic. The sound weaves through the trees, sometimes impossibly close, yet nothing is visible. Unable to sleep, Ethan steps outside the tent to investigate. With his flashlight, he scans the woods, but sees nothing. Then, just beyond the beam's reach, a faint shadow moves. The whistling stops, replaced by soft tapping on the tent walls. Rachel begs him to come back inside. The tapping grows louder, almost rhythmic, as if mocking their fear. They hold each other tightly, praying for daylight. At dawn, they hastily pack their belongings. However, as they attempt to leave, the whistling resumes, now frantic and persistent. It seems to follow them, weaving through the trees as they hike back to their car. Exhausted and terrified, they finally reach the safety of their vehicle. Back home, Rachel reviews a recording they took of the whistling, only to notice faint voices harmonizing with the sound. She researches online and finds identical accounts of the whistler, a malevolent entity said to protect certain areas of the Appalachian forest. The couple vows never to return. What would you do if you were surrounded by shadows, figures you can't touch, voices you can't understand, and an overwhelming sense that you're not supposed to be there? 4 friends on a camping trip in Yellowstone found themselves the target of something ancient and unexplainable. A warning ignored, a presence awakened. What followed is a night of terror they'll never forget. 4 friends, Tyler, Anna, Jake, and Mia, arrive at Yellowstone, excited to enjoy a weekend of hiking and camping. Tyler, the jokester, immediately sets the tone by snapping tree branches and mocking the park's warnings about respecting nature. Anna, the most cautious, finds his behavior unsettling. The group sets up camp, laughing as Tyler imitates a park ranger's voice, jokingly warning, "The land remembers." However, an elderly ranger overhearing them simply stares, muttering, "It always does." That night, as they sit around the campfire, they hear soft, deliberate footsteps circling their camp. Tyler claims it's just wildlife, but the steps sound too steady to be an animal. Mia points out the eerie quiet, No crickets, no wind. The footsteps stop abruptly, and a low, guttural whisper comes from the darkness. Despite their unease, the group dismisses it as their imaginations playing tricks. During a late-night bathroom trip, Tyler spots a shadowy figure standing at the tree line. At first, he thinks it's Jake playing a prank, but the figure doesn't move, even when Tyler waves his flashlight. Back at camp, he nervously jokes about it, but Anna notices his usual bravado is gone. She wakes up later that night to see a shadow inside their tent, looming over Tyler. When she screams, it vanishes, leaving the group shaken and paranoid. The next evening, the shadows grow bolder. At least 5 figures appear around the camp, just beyond the light of their fire. Their shapes are human-like, but distorted, with elongated limbs and faint, glowing eyes. The group's flashlights reveal nothing when shown directly, but the shadows reappear as soon as the light passes. The whispers intensify, blending into a cacophony of unintelligible murmurs that seem to mock Tyler's earlier jokes. Tyler, now terrified, tries to apologize aloud, yelling into the darkness that he's sorry for disrespecting the land. The shadows freeze for a moment before moving closer. Jake grabs a burning stick from the fire and swings it around, forcing the shadows to retreat momentarily. The group huddles together, praying for dawn. At sunrise, the shadows disappear. The group packs up in silence, leaving behind their camping gear in their haste. Tyler, usually the life of the party, is visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he drives them back. Anna later researches similar encounters and finds chilling accounts of shadow beings tied to sacred land. Imagine camping near an abandoned mining town. The wind carries faint whispers. Tools clink as if unseen hands are at work, and shadows flicker where no light should cast them. A solo adventurer sought peace in the isolation, but found something waiting for him, a presence still tethered to the ruins. What happened next will leave you questioning the unseen forces of history. Daniel, a solo adventurer, sets out to explore an abandoned mining town known for its eerie beauty. As he arrives, the decaying buildings seem frozen in time, their wooden beams groaning in the wind. He sets up camp near the largest structure, an old saloon. The silence is deafening, broken only by the occasional gust of wind. On his first night, Daniel hears faint metallic clinking, like mining tools striking rock. Convinced it's just the wind playing tricks, he ignores it. The next morning, he finds his belongings slightly rearranged, but no tracks in the surrounding dirt. The second night is worse. Daniel feels a hand brush his shoulder while sitting by the fire. He spins around, but no one is there. Items in his tent fall over inexplicably, and he hears faint whispers, too faint to understand. His flashlight flickers as if something drains its energy. Desperate, Daniel speaks aloud, offering peace. The activity stops momentarily, replaced by the sensation of being watched. Suddenly, his campfire flares up, illuminating the silhouette of a figure in the distance. It stands motionless before disappearing into the darkness. Daniel decides to leave, but finds the path back to his car feels longer, as if the terrain has shifted. He hears footsteps following him, but never sees anyone. When he finally reaches his car, he feels an overwhelming sense of relief, only to hear the whispers again as he starts the engine. After returning home, Daniel researches the town and learns about a group of miners who perished protecting their claim. Locals believe the area is haunted by their restless spirits, warning anyone who disturbs the land. They say the wilderness hides creatures older than civilization. In Yosemite National Park, hikers and campers tell tales of a bizarre, silent being. Its tall, spindly legs moving unnaturally through the trees. 4 campers dismiss the stories as folklore, but their night in the forest proved that legends have roots in reality. What they saw can only be described as something otherworldly. 4 friends, Darren, Lisa, Erica, and Scott, plan an overnight trip to Yosemite, targeting a secluded area known for stunning views and strange legends. They set up camp near a dense grove, joking about the local myth of the night crawler, a strange, faceless creature said to wander the forest at night. Darren, the skeptic, dismisses the stories as campfire tales, while Erica can't shake an unease about the looming ancient trees. The group spends the day hiking and taking photos. Lisa notices that several pictures on her phone appear distorted, with faint white streaks in the background. She chalks it up to bad lighting, but Erica insists on deleting them, feeling a strange sense of dread. As night falls, the forest becomes eerily silent. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves are replaced by an oppressive stillness. Around midnight, Scott steps away from the campfire to relieve himself. Moments later, the group hears him call out, his voice trembling. They rush to find him frozen in place, staring at the tree line. A pale, humanoid figure with impossibly long legs and no discernible face stands just beyond the trees. It moves slowly, its legs bending unnaturally as it glides between the trunks. Before anyone can react, the creature disappears into the darkness. The group returns to the camp in a panic, locking themselves in their tent. They hear faint rustling, then a slow, deliberate dragging sound circling their campsite. Darren tries to rationalize the sounds, but his voice betrays his fear. Suddenly, the tent fabric stretches inward, as if something is pressing against it. The group holds their breath, too terrified to move, until the pressure vanishes. At dawn, they decide to leave. As they pack up, Erica notices large, perfectly round impressions in the dirt around their campsite. Lisa feels a growing sense that they are being watched. As they hike back to the trailhead, the dragging sound returns, growing louder and closer, but they never see the source. The group finally reaches their car, overwhelmed with relief. Days later, Lisa discovers faint, distorted figures in the background of their photos, eerily resembling the creature they saw. Darren, still in denial, refuses to talk about the incident. Erica, however, believes they encountered the mythical nightcrawler, a being not meant to be disturbed. What would you do if you found yourself trapped in a place that seems to bend reality? A canyon so narrow and deep that sunlight barely reaches its floor. 3 experienced hikers ignored the warnings about the chute of death, a place shrouded in mystery and fear. What they found wasn't just a natural formation. It was something alive, something hungry. This is the chilling tale of their descent into darkness and the horror that awaited them. Greg, Matt, and Sarah are avid adventurers who pride themselves on conquering remote wilderness challenges. On a weekend trip to an unexplored area of the Rockies, they hear locals talking about the Chute of Death, a narrow slot canyon with a notorious reputation. The canyon is said to have claimed the lives of many climbers, their screams supposedly heard echoing for miles. Intrigued and dismissive of the warnings, the trio decides to make it their next challenge. The hike begins as exhilarating. The rugged landscape offers stunning vistas, and they joke about making the chute their trophy expedition. When they reach the entrance to the canyon, an unmarked trail leads them downward into the narrow opening. The air feels cooler, heavier, but they chalk it up to the shade. The chute's towering walls seem to close in, with the sunlight above growing thinner as they proceed. The first hour in the canyon is uneventful, but unsettling. The walls are unnaturally smooth, as if carved by something other than water. As they descend further, Greg notices strange symbols etched faintly into the stone, interlocking circles and jagged lines. He brushes it off as graffiti left by other climbers, but Sarah feels a creeping unease. The narrow path soon forces them to walk single file. Sarah, at the back, hears faint whispers that seem to come from the walls themselves. She stops to listen, but the whispers fade into the sound of the wind. She doesn't mention it, not wanting to seem paranoid. Matt, leading the way, suddenly slips and scrapes his leg on a jagged rock. The injury should bleed, but instead, the wound looks darkened and oddly charred. Sarah, inspecting it, says, "This isn't right." Greg tries to stay positive, but even he can't shake the growing feeling that the canyon is watching them. As the group moves deeper into the chute, they begin to notice that their echoes don't behave normally. Shouts and laughter reverberate back, distorted and overlapping, almost as if mimicked by unseen voices. Matt suggests turning back, but Greg insists they're close to finding something incredible, a hidden chamber, or maybe even artifacts. The walls of the canyon begin to tighten further, and a chilling wind picks up. Greg suddenly freezes, pointing ahead. In the faint light, a shadow moves across the walls, too large and too fluid to be any of them. The shadow appears to melt into the stone, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. That night, they camp in a small clearing they find within the canyon. Despite their exhaustion, sleep is elusive. Sarah wakes to a loud cracking sound, like rocks shifting overhead. The group watches in terror as tiny stones begin to fall around them, and the canyon walls seem to groan. The next morning, they press on, hoping the canyon will open up soon. Instead, they find themselves in a wide chamber, littered with remnants of climbing gear. Old ropes, rusted carabiners, and weathered backpacks. Sarah picks up a notebook from one of the bags, its pages filled with frantic scrawls. "Can't escape. The walls are alive. Don't follow the voices." As they explore the chamber, the air grows heavy with a foul smell, like rotting meat. Suddenly, the shadows in the room begin to coalesce into a towering figure. Its form is indistinct, shifting constantly like smoke. A low, guttural sound fills the chamber, almost like a growl, and the group feels an oppressive force pushing them backward. Panic sets in as the group scrambles to escape. The canyon, once narrow and winding, now feels like an endless labyrinth, the walls twisting unnaturally. The whispers return, louder now, forming words. "Why are you here? Leave." Matt collapses, clutching his leg. He screams that something is pulling at him, though nothing is visible. Greg and Sarah drag him forward, but the sensation follows, as if unseen hands are gripping him. The shadowy figure reappears, moving with impossible speed. its form melting and reforming as it chases them. Greg throws his flashlight at it in desperation, and for a moment, the light seems to slow it down. The group realizes they need to keep moving or risk being consumed. The trio stumbles out of the narrowest part of the canyon, finally seeing daylight ahead. The shadow stops at the threshold of the chute, as if unable to follow them into the open. Matt, visibly shaken, insists they keep moving, refusing to look back. When they finally reach their car, they collapse into silence, too overwhelmed to process what happened. As they drive away, Sarah looks out the window and swears she sees the shadow lingering at the canyon's entrance, watching them leave. Please subscribe for more, or else I will feel bad.